In the later part of the 5th century, a missionary from Britain living among non-Christian communities in Ireland wrote with visible amazement that the sons and daughters of Irish rulers were turning toward a new kind of life. Young people from powerful families, he said, were choosing to become monks, and young women were choosing a life devoted to Christ, so many that he claimed he could not even count them. The writer was Patrick, later remembered as Ireland's patron saint, and he repeated the point because it mattered to him. It proved that the new faith was no longer just a foreign idea on the margins, but something beginning to reach the very centre of Irish society. Patrick's surviving writings open the earliest window onto Christian women in Ireland, even though he was not the first missionary to appear there. What he describes is startling when imagined through the eyes of the time. In a world where alliances, inheritance, and status were strongly tied to marriage and family strategy, young women were beginning to refuse marriage, reject sexual life, and praise poverty as a virtue. To many Irish families, especially those still devoted to older gods and customs, these choices must have looked baffling, even threatening. A daughter who refused marriage was not only rejecting a suitor, she was challenging expectations about family duty, social order, and the future of a lineage. If it were possible, the best way to understand these early Christian women would be to first paint a clear picture of the world Christianity entered. The older religion, the everyday standing of women, and whether there were already female specialists in sacred roles. That background would make it easier to see what changed, what continued, and how new Christian communities judged women who pursued religious lives. In many regions of the late Roman and post-Roman world, historians can do this because pre-Christian sources exist, or because outside observers recorded details. Ireland is different. Almost no written descriptions survive from the earlier centuries. Patrick is not just the first Christian author whose words remain from Ireland. He is the first Irish-based author of any kind whose narrative text survives. The usual outside witnesses that help historians elsewhere are largely missing. No travelling Greek left an account of journeys in Ireland, and Roman armies never tried to conquer it. So there is nothing like the vivid Roman descriptions that exist for Gaul or Britain. The traces Ireland did leave from early times are frustratingly thin. Some stone inscriptions survive, written in a script often linked in popular imagination with mystery and magic. Yet they are mostly simple memorial statements from the period when Christianity was spreading. Even that writing system appears to have been developed during this same era and shaped by the Latin alphabet. Large-scale writing in Ireland begins much later, when society was already deeply Christian. The people who produced those texts were churchmen, and their interests were not focused on preserving a careful record of pagan life. They wrote prayers, biblical interpretation, hymns, and accounts of saints. Sometimes they added brief year entries about earlier times, but they rarely paused to describe what religion looked like before the new faith arrived. Later, heroic tales do present a world filled with older gods and legendary rituals. Yet those stories were shaped by Christian writers long after the events they claim to reflect, so their details cannot be treated as direct reports from the old religion. Even so, those early medieval portrayals are not useless. They show how Christian Irish authors imagined their own past and what kinds of female religious figures they believed had existed before Christianity. Within tight limits, a few broad points can be made about pre-Christian Irish religion and gender. Patrick himself gives only a single, almost casual observation about the older worship, mentioning devotion to the sun. Beyond that, the strongest clues suggest a landscape of many local cults, rather than one unified national religion, with divine figures tied closely to particular places. In other Celtic regions, a similar pattern appears. Gods and goddesses connected to rivers, springs, hills, and groves, often with different qualities emphasised in different communities. In Ireland, later traditions frequently link rivers and waters with female divinities, echoing a wider Celtic habit of associating water with feminine sacred power. Some of the best-known Irish divine figures in later writings include warlike goddesses. One famous example is the Morrigan, who appears in multiple forms and is shown helping or obstructing warriors, shaping battles, and speaking prophecies. Evidence from outside Ireland hints that war goddesses were not unique to Irish imagination. Celtic communities in Britain and the continent also produced images and stories that connect female divinities with conflict, victory, and fate. Another theme found in later Irish material is the repetition of goddesses in groups of three, a pattern that some interpret as a wider Celtic habit. Though scholars do not all agree on how common or meaningful this was in earlier centuries. Stories also exist about divine femininity linked to kingship and fertility, where a female embodiment of sovereignty grants legitimacy to a ruler. These tales are late and reflect the political concerns of the time they were written, but they reveal how powerful the symbol of sacred femininity could be when discussing authority. Physical evidence is even more limited. Unlike some ancient cultures that left clear female statues or temples filled with images of goddesses, Ireland offers few unmistakably female representations from the relevant period. Some carvings are hard to date and may even belong to the Christian centuries. Other famous figures, sometimes assumed to be pagan survivals, are now understood as later Christian creations. The presence of goddesses in story does not automatically mean women held equal power in society. In fact, nearly every surviving clue suggests that Ireland, around the time of Christianization, was deeply patriarchal. Patrick's own experiences, as he describes them, point to a world dominated by male authority. He speaks of fathers arranging marriages for daughters, and the law codes written later, which are often thought to preserve older social norms, place men in the dominant legal position, giving women lower social value in formal terms and limiting their independent action in public affairs unless a male guardian stood with them. That does not mean women had no rights. They could claim compensation for insults, seek legal redress in certain situations, and in some circumstances pursue divorce or work in recognised occupations. But the overall structure favoured male power. The hardest question is what women did in the older religious world. Older generations of scholars were eager to imagine a deep, prehistoric matriarchy behind Celtic religion, and they treated later folklore and romance as if it were a straightforward record of ancient reality. Modern historians are far more cautious. What can be said is that there are signs, however faint, that some women were associated with sacred expertise, often in connection with Druid-like roles. Druids, as far as the scattered evidence allows us to infer, were religious specialists, tied to rulers and politics as much as to ritual. They were credited with prophecy, blessing and cursing, judging, satire, and the use of powerful speech. Later, Irish legal and narrative traditions sometimes mention female counterparts. Women with magical skills, women acting as mediators in conflict, women described as druids, and women poets who are believed to wield near supernatural force through words. Stories tell of queens or noblewomen using learned magic in rivalries and struggles for power, sometimes claiming training from a druid father. Yet in most accounts, druids are male, and even where women appear, they seem exceptional rather than common, likely emerging through elite family networks. For a long time, Another idea captured imaginations: the claim that pagan Ireland contained female Druid colleges, and that some later nunneries were simply those institutions renamed. This view was popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries and stayed alive among writers who favoured the idea of religious survivals across centuries. It also became attractive to modern movements looking for ancient priestess centres. Certain details were repeatedly used as support, such as stories about a famous religious site that later Christians associated with a saint named Bridget, and a tradition of a sacred flame said to have been kept burning there. But when the evidence is weighed carefully, the foundations of the theory look weak. Classical authors mention all-female sanctuaries in parts of Gaul, but that does not prove such institutions existed in Ireland. The earliest clear description of the famous flame appears very late, centuries after the era in question, and later, medieval writers often projected their own assumptions backward. The early saints' stories about Bridget do not emphasise a pagan sacred past for the site, and archaeology has not provided the kind of excavated proof that would make such claims solid. The idea cannot be completely disproved, but by modern standards it rests more on desire than on evidence. Into this shadowy world, Christianity began to take root. The most reasonable scenario places the earliest Christian communities along Ireland's eastern coast, where contact across the sea was most frequent. The new faith may have arrived through captives taken in raids, through migrants fleeing instability in Britain, through Irish travellers who converted abroad, or through early missionaries who crossed the sea before Patrick. Whatever the exact route, by the early 5th century, there were enough believers to require organised leadership. That reality matters because it pushes against romantic claims of a secret church founded directly in the earliest days of Christianity. Legends about an ancient, purer Celtic church that existed independently of the wider Christian world have had a long life, especially in Britain. They make for dramatic storytelling, but the most credible evidence points instead to a Christianity shaped by the Christianized Roman world and carried into Ireland through Britain and Wales. For understanding early Christian women, the most valuable thing Patrick leaves behind is not a full history, but a vivid glimpse of conversion in motion. He describes at least one high-born Irish woman, newly baptized, who soon announces that she's been called to become a virgin, devoted to Christ. Patrick celebrates the speed and intensity with which she embraces the vow. Then he widens the lens and speaks of many women doing the same, often against their families' wishes, enduring pressure, insults, and hostility. His attention lingers especially on enslaved women, who faced the harshest threats and intimidation, yet still pursued the Christian life. In a society where enslaved people had little control over their bodies or futures, the idea of a slave woman claiming a sacred vow carried enormous tension. Patrick uses these examples to show that the new religion could strengthen even the most vulnerable, and that its call could cut across rank and power. What is striking is the stance he takes toward disobedience. Many influential Christian thinkers of the wider Western world praised virginity, but they often urged daughters to persuade fathers rather than openly defy them, insisting that female holiness still required submission to male authority. Patrick's tone is different. He praises women who refuse marriage even when fathers forbid it, and he admires enslaved women who resist masters. That approach makes more sense when seen through the popular religious storytelling of the age. Heroic narratives of holy women who resist pagan family control, choose chastity, and endure suffering rather than surrender their vows. Patrick writes like a man who knows those stories and wants his audience to understand that Ireland, too, now has women capable of such devotion. In this period, becoming a religious virgin was not necessarily tied to living in a monastery. Across Western Europe, a vow of chastity was the key marker. Some women were formally consecrated by a bishop, sometimes with a ritual veil placed upon them. But many simply dedicated themselves through a vow and signalled the change through clothing and public identity. Over time, different regions tried to regulate the process because vows created social disruption and legal confusion, especially when a woman later attempted to abandon the life. Ireland's earliest rules are sparse, yet they strongly imply that a vow was treated as binding and that breaking it was considered a serious moral breach. Later, Irish penitential practice even imagines the possibility of restoring a fallen virgin to her earlier status after long penance, a sign of intense belief in moral repair and spiritual transformation. By the 6th century, Ireland also begins to show signs of native missionary energy. Saints' stories and later records remember women as founders of religious communities and as active figures in spreading the faith, even allowing for the exaggerations and stylized patterns of hagiography. The consistent impression is that women were not merely passive converts or hidden recluses. They travel, teach, establish communities and act as visible representatives of the new religion. Strict enclosure does not dominate the earliest picture. Instead, early Irish Christianity appears to grow through movement, personal networks, and charismatic leadership, with women included in that energetic expansion. Underneath all of this lies a powerful moral ranking system inherited from wider Christian thought. The belief that holiness could be measured by distance from sexual life. The highest praise fell on those who renounced sex entirely, especially virgins. Widows who chose chastity occupied an honoured place as well, and married believers were still accepted, though usually treated as a lower grade of spiritual achievement. This framework helped early Christian writers explain why virginity mattered so much, and why young women refusing marriage could be celebrated as spiritual heroes. In Ireland, the system seems to have taken deep root, and it reinforced the idea that a vowed virgin could stand at the very top of Christian society, equal in spiritual dignity to monks and great church leaders. Sometime between the lifetime of Patrick and the beginning of the 7th century, new kinds of religious communities began to appear in Ireland. These were places where consecrated women lived together under the leadership of an abbess. At the start of the 7th century, many religious women still remained in their family homes, much as they had done in Patrick's time, but increasing numbers lived in organised settlements. During the 5th and 6th centuries, hundreds of churches and small monastic sites were founded across the island, and by around the year 600, Ireland contained numerous small religious settlements for women as well as a few larger and more established nunneries. These communities emerged through the efforts of devout women who later came to be honoured as saints, along with the support of missionaries and church leaders, who helped them establish places where a religious life could take root. The surviving evidence is limited and often difficult to interpret, but enough remains to reveal the outline of how these early communities developed. Archaeology provides some of the earliest physical traces of these religious settlements. Excavations have uncovered small ecclesiastical sites that date back to the 5th and 6th centuries, yet the earliest layers of these places usually contain no church buildings. Instead, they begin as burial grounds. In many locations, the first sign of Christian activity appears to have been the establishment of a cemetery. Over time, these burial places developed further. A single grave, often treated with special care, became the focal point. Later, a small shrine might be built over that grave, and eventually a wooden church would be constructed nearby. In some cases, the builders unknowingly disturbed older burials when creating the foundations for these later structures. This pattern suggests that certain burial places gradually grew into recognized centers of worship rather than being planned as churches from the beginning. Despite the strong tradition that missionaries and early saints founded churches and monasteries during their lifetimes, clear archaeological remains of these earliest foundations have rarely been identified with certainty. Some early burial sites include nearby clusters of small huts or dwellings, yet the identity of their inhabitants remains uncertain. It is possible that these simple structures once housed monks, ascetics, or consecrated virgins who lived in small religious groups. If so, they may represent the earliest Christian settlements described in later tradition. Until clearer evidence emerges, a gap remains between the archaeological picture and the written traditions that describe energetic missionary founders establishing churches across the land. Interpretations of early burial sites have often been shaped by assumptions about how early Christian communities were organized. Many archaeologists have treated burial grounds as ordinary community cemeteries, even when small chapels or dwellings appear nearby. This interpretation becomes even more common when female burials are present. Female remains have frequently been taken as proof that the cemetery belonged to the general population rather than to a religious community. Such assumptions overlook the possibility that some women buried at these sites were religious virgins, widows devoted to the church, or members of clerical families who maintained in hereditary churches. The presence of women in a cemetery does not necessarily mean that the site was secular, and reconsidering such evidence may help identify places where early religious women actually lived. One site off the western coast of Ireland offers a revealing example. The earliest remains there include a small dwelling, a chapel, and several graves dating to the 6th century. Among the burials is that of a woman. The site has long been described as a male hermitage with a cemetery used by a nearby population simply because a female burial was present. Yet the woman buried there may have been part of the religious community itself. She could have been an ascetic living alongside male companions, a vowed virgin sharing a disciplined life with a small group of holy men, or a member of a clerical family responsible for maintaining the site. Another possibility is that she was the wife of a priest who served the community. Each of these possibilities would explain why she was buried there without requiring the cemetery to be secular. Recognizing that religious women must have been buried somewhere is essential for understanding their lives. Unless female burials are considered possible evidence of religious communities, the archaeological traces of early nuns may remain hidden. A more flexible interpretation of the evidence could reveal valuable insights into the places where these women lived and worked during the earliest centuries of Irish Christianity. Written sources provide another window into the development of women's religious communities, although these sources also present serious challenges. The main texts that describe early foundations are the lives of saints. These works were not intended as objective history. Their authors aim to demonstrate divine power and to celebrate the holiness of particular saints. Stories were shaped to create dramatic narratives, and entire episodes were sometimes adapted from earlier writings. Many of these texts followed established literary patterns, drawing inspiration from earlier Christian biographies. They also served institutional purposes, often promoting the prestige and influence of particular churches by emphasizing the importance of their founding saints. Accounts of women in these writings must be read with special care. Nearly all were written by men, and female characters appear through male interpretation. Some women described in these stories may represent symbolic ideals rather than real individuals. Religious writers of the early Middle Ages frequently use symbolic language drawn from scripture, and female figures sometimes served as spiritual metaphors. Even with these limitations, the lives of saints remain the only substantial written source for understanding how women's religious communities developed. Many of these texts were written within a century of the events they describe, and although shaped by literary tradition, they likely preserve genuine memories of early foundations. These writings consistently describe the establishment of churches and monasteries as the work of travelling missionary leaders. Saints are portrayed moving constantly from place to place, baptizing converts, preaching to local populations, and founding new communities. They rarely remained in a single location for long. Instead, they created networks of settlements on land granted by local rulers and noble families. Although later writers sometimes exaggerated the number of foundations attributed to particular saints, the general pattern of travelling missionaries, establishing churches across the countryside, appears to reflect historical reality. Women's foundations are presented in the same way. Female saints are shown travelling widely, gathering followers, receiving support from local leaders, and founding religious settlements. Some women appear to have established communities largely through their own initiative. In these stories, female founders travel long distances without attracting criticism or suspicion. They preach, perform miracles, build relationships with bishops and other saints, and acquire land for religious use. Their independence is presented as natural and unremarkable. The accounts often emphasize that female founders did not rely entirely on their families. Parents sometimes appear as donors who provided resources, but the women themselves are portrayed as the central figures in the process. A consecrated woman might accept land offered by supporters and establish a community in her own right. Even less famous religious women are described travelling across Ireland to gather donations and secure property for new foundations. These stories suggest that it was considered believable that a consecrated woman could organise and lead a religious settlement through her own efforts. Other traditions describe women who began their religious lives under the guidance of established missionaries, and later founded communities of their own. Some women first served as companions or disciples of well-known saints before travelling out to establish churches independently. In such accounts, the initiative often belongs to the woman herself, while the practical details of acquiring land or resources remain unrecorded. The emphasis remains on the authority and determination of the female founder. Male missionaries also played an important role in establishing women's communities. Religious law and social custom limited women's access to land and authority, and women could not become priests. As a result, male church leaders often helped consecrated women establish settlements. Missionaries are described placing groups of nuns in newly founded churches and leaving them to lead their communities. Some female monasteries appear to have grown out of these arrangements. Even when a male founder is not explicitly credited with establishing a settlement, his patronage may be suggested by gifts of sacred objects or other forms of support. These accounts show that early Irish Christians believed women had led churches and religious settlements from the earliest period. Many communities later honoured female founders as their original leaders. At such places, devotion often centred on the grave or relics of the founding saint, whether she had originally founded the settlement herself or had been placed there by a missionary. Descriptions of daily life in these communities are uneven, but some general patterns appear. Religious women often lived in small groups that included consecrated virgins, students, and assistants. Some communities also included lay workers and servants. Priests visited regularly to celebrate religious services, and in time, some communities acquired resident clergy. Bishops might occasionally reside with these groups as well. These early settlements were not isolated institutions, but active centres of religious life within a largely non-Christian environment. Movement played a central role in this early religious culture. Holy women travelled frequently between different settlements and regions. They stayed at existing churches, visited other religious leaders, and welcomed pilgrims. Travel appears to have been an accepted part of religious life for women, as well as for men. Female saints are described visiting other holy women and staying in their communities. The impression is of a loose network of religious settlements, connected by personal relationships and shared activity. This portrayal of active female missionaries differs sharply from the ideals found in many earlier Christian writings, which often discourage women from travelling or taking public roles. The Irish model of female sainthood emphasised mobility, leadership, and cooperation between men and women. Religious women are shown studying under male teachers, maintaining friendships with clergy and working alongside them in the spread of Christianity. These features do not match the examples provided by many well-known Christian biographies from earlier centuries. In those works, saints often lived as hermits or in enclosed monasteries, and women's roles were usually more restricted. Irish writers appear to have drawn inspiration from a different tradition. Stories about the early apostles and early Christian martyrs portrayed women travelling, teaching, and resisting marriage in order to pursue religious lives. These narratives circulated widely in early medieval Europe and appear to have influenced Irish authors strongly. In these stories, holy women often encountered travelling apostles, learned from them, and devoted themselves to religious life. They rejected marriage despite family pressure and devoted themselves to teaching and conversion. Similar patterns appear in Irish accounts of female saints. Women are shown meeting missionaries, receiving instruction, and dedicating themselves to religious service. Some become teachers and missionaries in their own right, spreading Christianity among pagan communities. These narrative patterns may reflect the historical situation in Ireland during the early centuries of conversion. Christianity was still spreading and missionary work remained essential. Women who participated actively in this effort may have been seen as valuable allies in the expansion of the new religion. Rather than encouraging strict enclosure, early Irish Christianity appears to have allowed consecrated women to take part in missionary activity and community leadership. The famous monastery associated with Bridget provides an example of how these traditions have been interpreted. Some later writers have suggested that Bridget was originally a pagan goddess, whose cult was transformed into Christian devotion. The evidence for such a transformation is uncertain. Very little reliable information survives about the supposed goddess, and there is no clear proof that a pagan sanctuary existed on the site later occupied by the monastery. Early traditions describing Bridget as a saint emphasize her role in promoting Christianity rather than preserving older beliefs. Later, writers connected her name with fire and with certain traditional crafts, but early sources do not strongly emphasize these themes. Associations between Bridget and fire imagery can easily be explained by common Christian symbolism. Light and flame were widely used in Christian language to represent divine presence. Similar imagery appears in accounts of many male saints as well. Stories about a sacred flame maintained at the monastery appear only in much later sources. Earlier writings make no mention of such a practice. When perpetual fires are recorded in later centuries, they appear at several monasteries, including those led by men. This suggests that such practices developed within Christian tradition rather than surviving from pagan worship. Claims that the monastery stood within an ancient sacred grove also rest on late traditions. The name of the settlement most likely refers to a church built from oak, rather than to a sacred tree preserved from earlier religion. The community itself shows clear signs of strong Christian identity and hostility toward pagan practices. Later poems celebrating the monastery contrast its success with the decline of nearby pagan centres, presenting Christianity as the clear victor. The picture that emerges from both archaeology and written tradition is incomplete, but consistent in broad outline. Early Irish Christianity allowed consecrated women to take active roles in the spread of the new faith. Women founded religious communities either through their own initiative or with the help of male missionaries. Settlements often grew gradually from burial grounds into recognized centers of worship. The lives of saints present these developments in idealized form, yet they likely reflect real patterns of activity. A journey through the old monastic landscapes of Ireland, such as the ruins at Glendalough or Clonmacnoise, offers one of the clearest ways to understand how early Irish monasteries once functioned. The arrangement of these sites reveals a type of community that was both religious and practical in its daily life. A monastery of moderate or large size usually occupied a broad, enclosed area marked by a sacred boundary that separated it from the surrounding countryside. Inside this boundary, there were open spaces, grazing areas for animals, clusters of small dwellings, and a number of churches. Many of the living quarters were small huts, some shaped like rounded domes that resemble beehives, while others served special purposes such as schools, writing rooms, or kitchens. The churches themselves were usually built of stone, although in earlier centuries wood had been more common. Even the largest churches were surprisingly small, often holding no more than a few dozen people standing close together, while the smallest prayer buildings could barely accommodate a handful of worshippers. When large crowds gathered, services were sometimes held outside at stone altars placed in the open air. Stone crosses marked important points within the enclosure and along its edges, and burial grounds lay at the heart of the settlement, usually arranged around the grave of a revered saint. These burial places were believed to carry special spiritual power, and many people hoped that burial near a holy figure would help ensure salvation. In overall appearance, an early Irish monastery resembled a small rural village rather than a single religious building. By the 7th century, this type of settlement had become widespread throughout Ireland as Christianity expanded across the island. Most monasteries housed men, but a number were founded for women, and at least one community included both sexes. Although written evidence for large female monasteries is incomplete, enough survives to reveal important details about their organisation and daily life. Their customs, routines, and responsibilities can be reconstructed in broad outline, even though many uncertainties remain. The best way to understand these communities is to examine the major female monasteries. Individually, since most are known today only by name and have never been studied in full detail. Among all the female monasteries of Ireland, Kildare stands as the most famous. Unfortunately, almost nothing remains from its earliest period because later construction covered the original buildings. Visitors today can see only scattered stone crosses, the remains of a round tower, and the foundations of a structure sometimes called the firehouse. In its early centuries, however, Kildare would have looked much like other monastic settlements that survive in better condition. It would have contained clusters of huts, small churches, workshops, and storage buildings within a sacred enclosure, while farmland and tenant dwellings stretched beyond its borders. Early descriptions portray it as a lively settlement with many inhabitants and a steady flow of pilgrims arriving from distant regions. The monastery's boundary was considered a protected zone where fugitives could seek safety from violence or legal punishment. People sometimes came there to escape enemies or avoid court proceedings, relying on the monastery's sacred protection. The heart of the community was a large wooden church built from oak, which gave the settlement its name. From the earliest period, this structure served as the main place of worship, where men and women gathered together for major services. This arrangement differed from some other monasteries. where the sexes worshipped separately in different buildings. The oak church remained an important feature for centuries, and historical records continue to describe it as an oak structure long after its foundation. The details of daily living arrangements remain uncertain. The nuns may have shared a large sleeping hall or lived in individual huts, and the monks must also have had their own dwellings, though no clear description survives. The abbess probably occupied a separate residence, as was typical for monastic leaders. At one time, the monastery included a house dedicated to scholars or elders, and this institution was directed by a religious woman during the 8th century. Kildare held an unusual position not only as a religious centre, but also as a political power. Its abbesses appear regularly in historical records for centuries, and the settlement became an episcopal centre at an early date. During the 7th century, it sought recognition as the leading church of Ireland, attempting to claim authority over other religious institutions. In doing so, it entered into rivalry with the powerful Church of Armagh. Both centres tried to establish influence beyond their immediate regions by building networks of dependent churches. Eventually, a compromise emerged in which each side retained authority within its own sphere, although neither gained complete supremacy. This arrangement was later described in stories that portrayed friendly agreements between the saints associated with the two churches, presenting cooperation where rivalry had once existed. The monastery maintained close ties with regional dynasties. The founding Saint Bridget belonged to an important Leinster family, and members of that lineage continued to supply leaders to the community even after their political dominance declined. Later, ruling families also established control over the monastery and eventually treated it as a central institution within their territory. The remains of the founders, preserved within the main church, served not only as objects of devotion but also as symbols of the monastery's prestige and authority. Over time, the monastery experienced periods of violence and disruption, including attacks and internal conflicts. Yet it remained an important intellectual centre. Religious texts continued to be copied and composed there, and its leaders were still considered important enough for their deaths to be recorded in historical chronicles. The monastery survived repeated invasions and continued to exercise influence for many centuries. Another well-known female monastery was located at Kildare, in the region of Munster. Today, little can be seen at the site, which lies in quiet countryside near the slopes of low mountains. Most of what is known comes from later writings that claim to describe the community in its early days, though these accounts may reflect conditions from much later periods. What can be stated with confidence is that the monastery maintained strong connections with the ruling family of the region. Its founding abbess became widely respected, and by the 9th century she was remembered as one of the most important religious women of southern Ireland. Some traditions suggest that monks were eventually present at Kildare alongside the nuns. Historical records mention abbots rather than abbesses in certain periods, which led some scholars to believe the monastery became exclusively male. Other evidence makes that unlikely. Religious poetry from the period directly addresses a community of nuns, indicating that women were still living there even when male leaders appear in the records. It is more likely that a male abbot supervised a female community, a situation known from other parts of early medieval Europe, where control of monasteries passed through family networks. Further north stood the monastery of Kildare, near the foothills of a prominent mountain. The remains of 2 stone churches survive there, though they date from centuries after the foundation. The monastery stood within the territory of the founding saint's own people, and early leaders came from the same lineage. Records mention a sequence of abbesses connected to this ruling family, showing that the monastery remained closely tied to regional politics. Although references to the site are limited, hymns and commemorations from early centuries confirm its importance. Some early writings hint that monks may once have lived alongside the nuns, suggesting that the community may have been mixed at certain times. Another female monastery stood at Clonbrony in the central region of Ireland. Early traditions attribute its foundation to holy women of the 5th or 6th century, though it achieved real prominence only later under a celebrated abbess. Stories about her emphasize the expansion and strengthening of the settlement, suggesting that the monastery grew considerably during her leadership. Earlier accounts describe the place as poor and undeveloped, with few buildings and a small population that included monks as well as nuns. By the 8th century, it had become a respected religious centre whose leaders were recorded in historical annals. Later traditions describe connections with major monasteries across Ireland and with local rulers, indicating that the community remained active within both religious and political networks. A smaller monastery associated with a saint named La Serre appears in early traditions as part of a larger federation linked to Kildare. This community is described as a house of religious women that eventually became subject to Kildare's authority. Later references to the place are rare, and it may have declined or disappeared by the High Middle Ages. Another female monastery stood near the River Shannon at Cloonburran. Almost no written description survives, and knowledge of the site depends on scattered references to abbesses and fires recorded in historical chronicles. The names of its founder and some members appear in early commemorations, confirming that it once held a recognised place among Irish religious communities. Later, evidence becomes increasingly scarce, suggesting that the monastery may have lost importance or ceased to exist before the end of the medieval period. Daily life in the larger women's monasteries was governed by rules and disciplines that bound the nuns to their religious commitments. Secular law recognised these obligations and treated monastic vows as legally binding promises. Although several monastic rules survive from early Ireland, none were written specifically for female communities. The practices followed by nuns must therefore be reconstructed from indirect evidence. Each monastery probably followed its own traditions, often believed to have been established by the founding saint. Stories describe founders returning in visions to correct discipline when it weakened, reinforcing the belief that the original rules remained authoritative even after the saint's death. Religious worship formed the centre of monastic life. Communities gathered at fixed hours throughout the day and night to chant psalms and prayers. The longest and most important service often took place before dawn. After these prayers, the abbess might address the community on matters of discipline or spiritual instruction. The rhythm of worship shaped the daily routine and reinforced the shared identity of the community. Ascetic practices were an important part of spiritual discipline. Stories describe saints and nuns undertaking severe fasts or long vigils, sometimes enduring cold or hunger as acts of devotion. Chastity was considered essential, and various methods were recommended to control desire. Fasting was believed to reduce physical temptation, and some individuals practiced extreme forms of self-denial. Despite these ideals, failures occurred. Religious law prescribed penances for sexual offences, including long periods of fasting or exile. These regulations applied equally to men and women and even acknowledged the possibility of relationships between members of the same sex. In most cases, offenders were allowed to remain within the community after completing their penance. The Mass stood at the centre of communal worship. It was usually celebrated at dawn on Sundays and feast days, and sometimes included hymns dedicated to particular saints. Liturgical practices were guided by detailed instructions describing the movements and gestures required during the ceremony. Some monasteries followed distinctive local traditions, while others sought to imitate practices associated with Rome. Kildare in particular claimed that its worship followed Roman custom closely, and that its ceremonies had been modelled on those used in the great churches of the Christian world. Communion was normally available to nuns, except during periods when ritual purity rules applied. Women were excused from certain duties at these times and refrained from receiving the sacrament until the period had passed. Despite these restrictions, they continued to participate in the religious life of the community. Many monasteries also served as centres of education. Children were sometimes fostered and taught basic learning within these communities. Girls could remain permanently, but boys were usually sent to male teachers as they grew older. Teachers within female monasteries were respected for their knowledge, and students might come from considerable distances to learn from them. Education formed an important part of monastic activity and helped spread religious learning throughout the country. Unlike later medieval nunneries, early Irish female monasteries were not strictly enclosed. Religious women moved freely outside their settlements and maintained regular contact with the surrounding population. They visited the sick, prayed for the dying, offered spiritual advice, and sometimes negotiated disputes. Travelling saints and visiting clerics were welcomed as guests, and communities maintained hospices for travellers. Monks and nuns cooperated in religious work and sometimes worshipped in the same churches, though usually in separate sections. These monasteries functioned not only as places of prayer but also as active centres of community life. Religious women participated in baptisms, oversaw penance, assisted the poor, and provided hospitality. They interacted regularly with local rulers and sometimes influenced political decisions. Their communities combined elements of monastic retreat with responsibilities resembling pastoral ministry. In this environment, the boundaries between monastery and parish were often unclear. Religious settlements provided both spiritual discipline for their members and religious services for the surrounding population. Female monasteries formed part of this wider system and played a visible role in the spread of Christianity across Ireland. Across early medieval Ireland, the religious houses described earlier represent only a small part of the world in which Christian women lived. Written sources from the period mention hundreds of nuns, far more than can be connected to the few large and long-lasting convents, such as Kildare, Killeedy, Killeavy, and Clonbrony. Calendars of saints compiled around the year 800 record the names of many holy women who were remembered and honoured by later generations. Genealogical collections written in the Middle Ages preserve even larger numbers of names. Some lists include over 100 female saints, while others record mothers of saints or women connected to major monasteries. Many entries also mention place names, suggesting that these women lived in a wide range of religious settings. The evidence makes it clear that the religious life for women in Ireland was not limited to a few famous convents, but extended across a varied landscape of churches, settlements, and small communities. One of the most surprising features of this landscape is the presence of nuns at monasteries, usually thought of as male institutions. Modern readers often imagine Irish monks as strict ascetics who avoided contact with women, but the surviving evidence tells a different story. Many monasteries included women as members of their extended religious households. Some lived in small communities attached to larger monasteries, sometimes within the same enclosure and sometimes nearby. Written sources describe monks and nuns living in close association, often worshipping in separate churches but sharing the same religious environment. The language used by early writers shows little anxiety about this arrangement. Women were not portrayed as dangerous temptresses, and contact between monks and nuns was treated as normal and sometimes even beneficial. The great religious centre of Armagh offers one of the clearest examples. At this important church, both men and women were said to live devoted religious lives side by side. They did not share the same buildings, but their communities were closely connected. Separate churches served different groups, yet the overall impression is of a unified religious settlement, where consecrated women were fully integrated into the spiritual life of the place. Later traditions describe churches associated with holy women and places dedicated to religious virgins within or near the monastery's boundaries. These references suggest that female communities remained part of Armagh's religious life over many generations. Other monasteries reveal similar arrangements. At Tallaght, near the Dublin Mountains, a reform movement devoted to strict religious discipline included a community of nuns alongside the monks. Rules for the monastery describe visits between the two groups and instruct monks to speak with the nuns in the presence of elders. Such meetings were considered useful for strengthening faith. The regulations even acknowledge that monks might experience temptation during these encounters, but emphasize that resisting such thoughts was part of spiritual growth. The tone of these rules shows that contact between men and women was accepted as a normal feature of religious life rather than something to be avoided entirely. Nearby, Finglas also had a residence for nuns, enclosed within its own boundary. Stories describe women requesting permission to live there and being accepted as members of the community. Other monasteries, such as Kells, Agaboy, and Clonfert, preserve traditions of nuns living either within the monastery itself or in nearby settlements closely connected to it. In some cases, the evidence is limited to a single reference, but taken together, these accounts demonstrate that women were present in many monasteries, that later tradition described as exclusively male. Not all female communities were tightly integrated with the monasteries to which they were linked. Some lived at a distance while still remaining under the authority or protection of a nearby religious house. A group of consecrated women might be led by an abbess, but still belong to the wider network of a major monastery. In other cases, the degree of connection is unclear. Some communities may have been independent, while others were closely supervised by abbots. The evidence suggests that arrangements varied widely, and that no single pattern governed all religious women. Another important setting for nuns was the Episcopal Church, a type of religious centre that served both as a monastery and as a place providing pastoral care to the surrounding population. These churches often had bishops and clergy who oversaw baptisms, burials, and regular worship. Some were founded by women or closely associated with female religious leaders. A nun might establish a church and later receive support from bishops who continued its work. In certain cases, small groups of nuns acquired land through gifts or personal effort and dedicated it permanently to religious use. These foundations could develop into lasting centres of Christian life, even when their origins lay in the initiative of a single woman. Many more nuns lived at small local churches scattered across the countryside. These sites are often known only by name, preserved in calendars or saints' stories. Earlier, historians sometimes imagined such places as temporary establishments created on family land and abandoned after the founder's death. Yet the evidence suggests a more complex reality. Some small churches served local communities for generations, even when they remained under the influence of particular families. Bishops exercised authority over these churches and ensured that religious services continued. A small church might function as a local centre for worship, burial, and community gatherings, while also providing a home for one or more religious women. Legal texts from the period confirm that nuns could belong to such local churches. A nun attached to a community church had responsibilities similar to those of a cleric. She might care for the poor, assist with religious duties, and remain under ecclesiastical discipline. Other sources suggest that nuns sometimes helped maintain church routines when priests were absent, or when resources were limited. References to nuns ringing bells or announcing the hours of prayer show that women could take part in the daily functioning of a church. Stories of saints provide vivid glimpses of these small communities. Some describe groups of poor nuns, living in simple conditions and relying on visiting saints for assistance. Others portray solitary women, maintaining small churches or serving local families through teaching or fostering children. These accounts often emphasize the modest resources of such women, suggesting that they depended more on their religious vocation than on the wealth of their families. Although these stories follow literary patterns, they likely reflect real situations in which religious women lived alone or in very small groups. The importance of burial places helps explain why many small churches survived long after their founders died. A holy woman buried at her church transformed the cemetery into a sacred place. People sought burial near saints because they believed this would help secure their salvation. Cemeteries associated with holy figures attracted visitors, offerings, and payments for burial rites. Such places became centers of local devotion where oaths were sworn, disputes settled, and gatherings held. Even if a religious community did not continue permanently, the church itself could remain an important part of the local landscape. Calendars of saints from the early 9th century preserve the names of many women remembered primarily through the churches where they lived or were buried. Some of these women were connected to famous monasteries, but many were known only by a single name and a place. Their genealogies were often forgotten, while the locations of their churches remained in memory. This pattern suggests that what mattered most to later generations was not a saint's family background, but the holy site associated with her life and death. Another form of religious life placed women alongside priests at small churches. Church law insisted that priests should live only with close relatives, yet legal texts indicate that priests sometimes shared their households with women described as nuns. These women may have been companions in religious work, wives, or consecrated partners living under vows. References to priests giving gifts to their nuns and warnings about priests visiting their nuns before performing baptisms show that such relationships were common enough to attract regulation. These women may also have carried out practical duties at the church, including maintaining worship routines and caring for visitors. Some women pursued a solitary religious life outside organized communities. Stories tell of nuns living alone with only a few animals for support, or struggling to provide hospitality for visiting saints. Others sought assistance from bishops or abbots, while maintaining independent lives. These solitary women appear frequently in religious stories, suggesting that such lives were familiar to the audiences for whom the stories were written. Although the details cannot always be verified, the recurring pattern indicates that solitary religious women formed a recognized part of the religious landscape. Evidence for women living on family property is surprisingly limited. It seems likely that many did so, yet written sources rarely describe such arrangements clearly. A few stories mention women living near their relatives or remaining in their family regions, but the details are uncertain. Some women may have been attached to nearby monasteries rather than living entirely within their family's households. Unlike regions where charters survive in large numbers, Ireland provides little documentation of property ownership, making it difficult to reconstruct these situations in detail. The idea that early Irish monasteries excluded women entirely does not match the historical record. A few saints were praised for avoiding contact with women, but such behaviour was described as exceptional rather than typical. Stories about monks who tried to avoid women often show them interacting with nuns, or receiving assistance from female communities. Even monasteries known for strict discipline sometimes maintained regular contact with religious women. Married couples could also appear within monastic settings. Some sources describe men and women entering monasteries together for periods of spiritual instruction. Rules from certain communities regulated when such couples might eat together or share a bed, and when they were required to live separately. These arrangements show that monasteries sometimes functioned as centres of spiritual training for the wider population, rather than as isolated enclaves cut off from ordinary life. The religious lives of women in early medieval Ireland followed many different paths, and this diversity also appeared in the kinds of religious vows they took. There were at least 2 main forms of female religious life, and possibly more. Some women entered the church as consecrated virgins, others as widows or penitents, and some lived in association with priests in religious households. A few became wandering pilgrims who devoted themselves to a life of spiritual travel. These different forms of religious commitment created a broad spectrum of religious identities, rather than a single fixed model of nunhood. Certain women who reached high spiritual reputation were granted an unusual position in both law and society. Some could attain a legal standing similar to that of priests or even bishops, reflecting the belief that their spiritual dedication had transformed their social identity. The highest forms of female religious life carried powerful symbolic meanings that were shared across Western Christianity, but also shaped by Irish traditions and values. The decision for a woman to enter religious life was rarely hers alone. Just as marriages were arranged through negotiations among relatives, entry into the church was normally guided by the decisions of male guardians and senior members of the kin group. Families had strong reasons to think carefully before allowing a daughter to become a nun. Women were essential to family strategies because marriages created alliances and strengthened political relationships. Refusing marriage meant giving up these opportunities. Marriage also brought economic benefits, since a bridegroom usually paid a bride price to the woman's family. When a woman became a nun, there was normally no comparable payment from the monastery, meaning the family lost a valuable source of wealth. Stories about famous saints show that relatives sometimes resisted strongly. In one well-known case, a young woman's brothers tried to force her into marriage because they did not want to lose the bride price that her marriage would have brought. Only extraordinary determination allowed some women to follow their religious calling despite family opposition. Yet families also found advantages in placing daughters in religious life. A woman connected to an important monastery could strengthen ties between her kin group and the church. Monasteries were not only religious centres, but also sources of wealth and influence. Having a daughter within a powerful religious community could bring prestige and protection to a family in much the same way as a successful marriage alliance. Ambitious dynasties sometimes tried to place female relatives into leading positions within major monasteries. If a woman could become an abbess, her family might gain access to resources and tribute associated with the institution. Religious life, therefore, offered an alternative path to influence, especially for families seeking to expand their power. Economic considerations could also favour religious life. Over time, some noble families began to provide dowries when their daughters married, transferring wealth to the husband rather than receiving payment from him. In such cases, allowing a daughter to enter a monastery might actually save family resources. Although women probably brought personal property with them when they joined a religious community, there is no clear sign that monasteries demanded large financial contributions. Religious life could therefore be a less expensive option than marriage. Without surviving legal records of property transfers, it is impossible to calculate the exact costs and benefits, but the evidence suggests that families considered these matters carefully. population patterns may have played a role as well. If there were more women than available husbands, some women would inevitably remain unmarried. Irish society allowed men to have more than one partner, but secondary wives held lower status than principal wives. Becoming a nun offered a more honourable alternative than entering such a relationship. A woman who joined a monastery could achieve respect and dignity that might otherwise have been difficult to obtain. For some families, the religious vocation of a daughter may have seemed a practical and respectable solution. Families had several ways to arrange a religious career for a daughter. They might place her in an established monastery, choosing the institution in much the same way they would select a suitable husband. The political connections and prestige of different monasteries would have been important factors. Another possibility was to establish a small church specifically for her. A kin group could set aside land and build a church without losing ownership of the property. The family would retain influence over the institution while allowing their daughter to live as a religious woman. If the woman gained a reputation for holiness and attracted followers, the church might become a centre of pilgrimage and income. After her death, the family could appoint another relative as successor, whether male or female, ensuring continued control. Some women probably lived as religious ascetics on family land without founding permanent institutions, supported by the resources of their kin. Among all forms of female religious life, the consecrated virgin held the highest status. Religious writings from the 7th century onward describe virgins as the most perfect example of Christian womanhood. They were portrayed as occupying the highest rank among believers. According to a widely accepted system of spiritual ranking, married people formed the lowest level. Widows and penitents stood above them, and virgins shared the highest place with monks and martyrs. This structure appealed strongly to Irish ideas about hierarchy and order. Virgins were not seen as inferior to male ascetics within this highest level. Instead, they were regarded as spiritual equals who had achieved the same degree of dedication. The ideal of the Virgin was closely connected with the example of Mary, who was regarded as the patron and model of all consecrated virgins. Religious writers described holy women as following her example and sometimes compared female saints directly with her. Poems and hymns celebrated famous abbesses as spiritual daughters or companions of Mary. In some texts, the closeness between holy women and Mary was expressed in familial language, calling a saint her sister or likeness. The symbolism extended to clothing as well. Irish virgins wore white veils and garments rather than the darker colours common elsewhere. The white dress suggested purity and heavenly glory and linked virgins symbolically, with angels who were often imagined as clothed in white. Another powerful image described the Virgin as the bride of Christ. By dedicating herself to a life without marriage, a nun was believed to enter a spiritual marriage with the ruler of heaven. This idea drew on ancient religious traditions that described God's relationship with his people in marital language. Early Christian writers developed the idea further, presenting the Virgin as the bride of Christ who belonged to him alone. Irish religious texts embrace this imagery enthusiastically. Hymns praised holy women as faithful brides who followed their heavenly spouse everywhere. Stories of consecration sometimes described the ceremony as the freeing of a woman from a human husband so that she could belong entirely to Christ. Although virgins renounced physical motherhood, they were believed to possess a different kind of fertility. Spiritual dedication was said to produce abundant fruit in the form of holiness and good works. The Virgin Mary provided the ultimate example, having given birth while remaining pure. Irish religious poetry often emphasized this paradox, describing the Virgin as fruitful without losing her purity. Some stories express the idea in imaginative ways. Certain female saints were described as nurturing the infant Christ in visions, symbolizing their role as spiritual mothers. A few legends even told of miraculous conceptions involving consecrated virgins, whose children later became famous saints. Religious women were also praised for strength and courage that seemed to overcome the limitations traditionally associated with their sex. Writers often described holy women in language normally reserved for warriors. They were portrayed as fighters against evil forces, armed with spiritual weapons and protected by divine power. Hymns called upon female saints to defeat demons and protect the faithful in spiritual battles. Other texts described groups of virgins as heroic hosts engaged in combat against sin. This imagery reflected a broader Christian idea that spiritual life resembled warfare against invisible enemies. Such descriptions did not imply that holy women ceased to be women. Writers continued to praise their humility, beauty, and gentleness alongside their strength. The ideal religious woman combined traditionally feminine virtues with qualities associated with spiritual heroism. In this way, the religious life allowed certain women to achieve authority and independence while still fitting within a society that remained strongly patriarchal. Consecrated virgins were formally admitted to religious life through ceremonies conducted by bishops. During these rites, the candidates received a veil and white clothing as signs of their new status. The ceremony usually included prayers and blessings, and the woman knelt in humility while offering her dedication to God. These rituals resembled those used elsewhere in Western Christianity, though the Irish practice of presenting a white garment appears to have been distinctive. The bishop who performed the ceremony represented the authority of the church, and there is no clear evidence that women conducted these rites themselves. Despite the high ideal attached to virginity, religious writers recognized that human weakness sometimes led to failure. A nun who broke her vow could perform penance and remain within the religious community. Rules prescribed periods of fasting or other discipline as punishment for sexual misconduct. In some cases, a woman might eventually regain her former standing after completing her penance. Stories of saints often describe abbesses discovering such failings and assigning appropriate discipline. Once penance had been completed, the nun usually continued her religious life without further disgrace. These accounts suggest that early Irish communities adopted a practical and forgiving approach, rather than permanently excluding those who had fallen. Irish law also reflected the special position of religious women. Certain nuns were granted privileges normally reserved for men, including a degree of legal independence. A consecrated virgin might be treated as equivalent in rank to senior clergy, and her testimony could be accepted in situations where ordinary women would not be believed. Legal texts sometimes described nuns as members of the ordered ranks of the church alongside priests and monks. At the same time, clear limits remained. Women could not perform priestly duties or claim authority in matters reserved for ordained clergy. Their status combined recognition of spiritual achievement with continuing distinctions between male and female roles. The legal material also shows that religious women occupied a distinct category within society. In some situations, they were treated like other women, while in others, they were governed by special rules connected with their religious commitments. Penalties for crimes against nuns could be severe, and compensation was often paid to their religious superiors rather than to their families. A nun who brought a complaint could sometimes appear in court in her own right, and stories tell of religious women successfully seeking justice against powerful opponents. These examples suggest that nuns could possess a level of authority unusual for women of the time. Nuns do not appear often in the legal and religious regulations of early medieval Ireland, yet this silence does not mean they were ignored. the laws protecting women applied equally to them, and injuries committed against any woman carried the same penalties regardless of social rank or occupation. Even so, their absence from many legal texts is striking. Detailed rules survive for many different categories of women, including noble wives, unmarried girls, and women of various social levels, yet nuns are rarely mentioned directly. This omission may reflect the assumption that religious women were already covered under broader legal definitions. Because nuns belong both to the female population and to the church, they automatically fell within systems of protection designed for both groups. When penalties were listed for crimes such as sexual assault against unmarried girls, nuns may simply have been included by definition, since the Irish term for a maiden was often used for a nun as well. The lack of explicit references to nuns in legal writings reflects a broader uncertainty about how they were categorized. In practice, they could be treated either as women under secular law or as members of the church under ecclesiastical authority. Judges probably decided each case individually, taking into account the nun's family background, wealth, and religious standing. This flexibility allowed religious women to occupy an unusual legal position. A virginal nun, in particular, could hold a status that set her apart from ordinary women, because she was believed to have overcome the weakness traditionally associated with the female condition. By renouncing sexuality and dedicating herself to God, she gained respect that placed her close to the highest ranks of the church. The ceremony that admitted a virgin into religious life resembled an ordination, and her commitment was often described as a form of sacred marriage, binding her permanently to the church. In certain respects, this position resembled that of a bishop, especially in the emphasis placed on vows, consecration, and spiritual authority. Even the possibility of failure did not entirely erase this status. A nun who broke her vow might still return to religious life after performing penance, and in some cases she could even be restored to her former rank among the virgins. This idea of spiritual recovery closely paralleled the treatment of clergy who committed serious faults, yet were allowed to resume their offices after repentance. Such parallels reveal how deeply the Irish associated virginal nuns with the higher ranks of the church. The belief that a woman could regain her spiritual standing after repentance was remarkable, since it placed her on nearly the same footing as ordained clergy in matters of discipline and forgiveness. Alongside virgins stood another group of religious women, those known as holy widows or penitents. A widow who embraced religious life entered a recognised path within the Irish Church and took a formal promise that bound her to a life of continence. In spiritual terms, she stood above ordinary married believers, but below the consecrated virgin. This middle position gave the widow a paradoxical character. She was honoured as a person devoted to God, yet she was also often regarded as someone who had turned away from a former worldly existence. Some widows had lost their husbands, while others had separated from them voluntarily or abandoned secular life after years of marriage. In both cases, the decisive element was the commitment to permanent chastity. The sources describing these women are limited and sometimes unclear. Only occasionally do they identify a woman explicitly as a religious widow. And in many cases, the distinction between an ordinary bereaved wife and a dedicated religious widow is difficult to determine. When texts do specify the status, they make clear that these women belonged to a recognised religious category. The term used for widow could describe not only a woman whose husband had died, but also one who had chosen to live in permanent continence. This broader meaning reflects ideas inherited from earlier Christian tradition, in which widowhood was defined primarily by renunciation rather than by bereavement. A woman might be called a widow even if her husband still lived, provided that she had formally abandoned married life. early Christian writings had already established widowhood as a respected vocation. By the time these ideas reached Ireland, the religious widow was seen as part of a spiritual hierarchy that included married believers, widows, and virgins. Widows occupied the middle level, rewarded for their discipline and perseverance, even though they lacked the perfect purity associated with virgins. Irish texts show clear awareness of this structure and describe widows as an organised body within the church. Their defining qualities were chastity and steadfast devotion. In Ireland, however, widowhood developed additional meanings. Religious widows were often linked with penitents and with the idea of turning away from a former life of sexual experience. Some sources use the terms widow and penitent almost interchangeably. This association does not necessarily imply moral failure. In many cases, the emphasis lay simply on the transition from secular life to religious dedication. A widow who embraced continence was understood to have renounced ordinary social existence and entered a new spiritual state. Other texts, however, describe the widow in more dramatic terms, portraying her as a woman who had abandoned a life of pleasure and atoned for past sins. Legal writings sometimes describe widows and other formerly worldly women as receiving the same honour price as virgins if they lived virtuously and performed penance. These passages suggest that religious life offered a path of restoration, allowing a woman who had lived in marriage or even in more irregular relationships to achieve respect and spiritual dignity. The idea reflects the contrast between Irish secular marriage customs and stricter Christian ideals. Because divorce and remarriage were accepted in Irish society, many women had more than one husband during their lifetimes. From a strict ecclesiastical perspective, such women could be regarded as having lived in a state close to moral disorder, even though their conduct was normal by local standards. Entering religious life allowed them to renounce this past and adopt a respected role within the church. Some women entered religious life only in old age after long secular careers. Literary sources preserve the voice of elderly women who remembered former wealth and beauty while living modestly within church communities. These figures appear as women who turned to religion late in life, sometimes after years of worldly success. Such women might not possess the learning or discipline of lifelong monastics, but they were nevertheless recognized as members of the religious community. Their conversion from secular life to devotion illustrates the flexibility of Irish monastic society and the range of paths open to women. Similar distinctions between different kinds of religious women existed elsewhere in Europe. On the continent and in England, sources distinguish between virginal nuns and other categories of women who entered religious life later. These parallels show that Ireland formed part of a wider Christian tradition. Yet the Irish evidence also suggests greater fluidity and less rigid definition than in many other regions. The boundaries between virgins, widows, penitents, and former laywomen were not always sharply drawn, and individual communities probably interpreted these categories in different ways. What united all of these women was their commitment to a life shaped by Christian belief and supervised by church authority. The highest position open to a nun in early medieval Ireland was that of abbess. This office stood at the summit of female religious life and carried both symbolic and practical meaning. Yet the abbess was not the only woman who could achieve exceptional standing within the church. Irish society recognised certain holy women who, even without leading monasteries, enjoyed honours similar to those of abbesses. These women gained prestige through holiness, pilgrimage, miracles, or devoted service to their communities. Their existence shows that the upper ranks of female religious life were varied and flexible rather than rigidly defined. Information about abbesses survives only in scattered fragments. Ireland produced no detailed manuals, explaining how abbesses were expected to rule. Unlike some regions of Europe, there are no collections of letters describing their responsibilities or authority. Instead, knowledge comes from a mixture of legal traditions, religious narratives, and brief notices preserved in historical records. These sources rarely provide family histories, which makes it difficult to trace the political connections of individual abbesses. Even so, enough clues survive to form a general picture of their authority and influence. Stories about female saints provide the clearest evidence. The founding saint of a monastery served as the ideal model for later abbesses. Since many important Irish female saints had themselves been abbesses, their lives shaped expectations for those who followed them. The abbess was expected to imitate the founder's virtues and to embody the spiritual character of the community. These narratives also reveal practical responsibilities, showing how abbesses guided their nuns and dealt with the outside world. The founder, therefore, served both as a spiritual example and as a blueprint for leadership. Although direct instructions for abbesses are lost, guidelines written for abbots give some idea of what was expected. Male monastic leaders were told to maintain discipline, remove troublemakers, and punish serious offences. Monks were required to obey their superior, and disobedience could bring severe penalties. It is likely that similar expectations existed in women's communities. Within her monastery, the abbess acted as ruler and supervisor. She oversaw daily life and ensured the survival of the community. If circumstances demanded it, she decided whether the monastery should move to a new location. She arranged supplies during times of shortage and organised defences during periods of danger. When hardship struck, she appealed for help from neighbouring churches and religious leaders. In large religious centres, some practical duties were handled by male officials, but this probably developed only in the most prominent monasteries. Smaller communities likely depended much more directly on the abbess herself. Admission into the monastery was her responsibility. She approved novices and sometimes accepted orphaned children to be raised within the religious household. She maintained discipline and ensured that the religious rule was followed. In accounts of monastic life, the abbess appears as investigator, judge, and authority figure. Her authority extended beyond the nuns themselves. The monastery included many people who were not fully religious members. Boys might be fostered there. Workers served the household, and labourers cultivated monastery lands. Some men lived there as penitents. All of these individuals fell under the abbess's authority. She investigated misconduct, demanded confessions, and assigned penances when necessary. As the holder of both spiritual and economic power, she was regarded as the mistress of the entire community. The ideal abbess balanced two seemingly opposite roles. She was expected to renounce worldly wealth while at the same time defending and expanding her monastery's influence. Religious poetry praised holy women for rejecting material riches, yet also celebrated their authority over lands and followers. A successful abbess strengthened her monastery's position while maintaining the appearance of humility and devotion. One of the most important duties was hospitality. In early medieval Ireland, hospitality was essential for maintaining social relationships and political alliances. Important visitors had to be received generously, and failure to provide proper hospitality damaged a household's reputation. Religious communities were deeply involved in this system. An abbess had to feed visiting clerics and travellers even during times of scarcity. Guests were welcomed ceremonially. Their feet were washed, meals were prepared, and lodging was arranged. Blessings were exchanged, and the gathering often ended in celebration. Religious stories frequently describe unexpected visitors arriving when supplies were nearly exhausted. The abbess then had to find meat, dairy products, and ale for her guests, despite the shortage. These accounts emphasize generosity rather than hardship. Providing hospitality enhanced a monastery's reputation and reinforced its connections with other religious communities. Hospitality worked in both directions. Abbesses themselves were often guests and expected to be received generously. Stories describe poor households sacrificing their last animals or supplies in order to honour visiting holy women. These episodes show that female monasteries participated fully in networks of mutual support. Religious hospitality was not limited to one gender, but formed part of a wider social system, linking monasteries and lay households alike. The authority of an abbess raises an important question. Irish law normally considered women legally dependent on male guardians. At the same time, abbesses inherited the authority of the saints who founded their monasteries. This created a paradox. A woman who led a monastery possessed great influence, but still lived within a legal system that often restricted female independence. Irish society placed great importance on the idea of a head or protector. Every person was expected to have someone who acted as a guiding authority. Spiritually, this role belonged to a confessor or spiritual advisor. In practical matters, it belonged to a legal guardian or superior. Fathers oversaw daughters, husbands oversaw wives, and church authorities oversaw religious women. According to legal traditions, a woman normally could not make contracts or dispose of property without the approval of such a superior. Despite these rules, there are signs that abbesses could act independently. Holy women were sometimes described as spiritual leaders in their own right. The founding saint of a monastery was believed to remain spiritually present, and the abbess inherited part of that authority as the saint's successor. This inheritance included spiritual prestige, social status, and sometimes legal rights. Certain religious women were recognized as possessing unusual independence. A woman of high rank or exceptional holiness could perform legal acts without seeking permission. Such figures were probably abbesses or other prominent religious leaders, rather than ordinary nuns. Many abbesses came from noble families and may have enjoyed authority both because of their religious office and because of their family background. Examples survive of religious women travelling to obtain donations and purchasing land. Some women granted property to other religious communities. Abbesses also exercised spiritual authority. They heard confessions, assigned penances, and advised both women and men. This role as spiritual guide gave them a position of leadership within their communities. The extent of an abbess's power depended largely on local circumstances. Some monasteries were small and dependent on larger churches. Their abbesses probably had limited influence. Others were wealthy and politically important. An abbess who belonged to a ruling dynasty and governed a rich monastery could wield considerable authority and might be treated as the effective head of the community. Symbols of authority reinforced this status. One important symbol was the pastoral staff known as a crozier. These staffs represented spiritual power and were associated with saints and church leaders. Missionaries carried them as signs of authority, and miracles were sometimes performed through their use. After the death of a saint, the staff became a treasured relic. Traditions describe female abbesses carrying such staffs, just as male leaders did. Holy women were said to bless land with them, to perform miracles, and even to discipline wrongdoers. If abbesses truly carried these staffs as part of their office, then their authority was outwardly similar to that of male monastic leaders. Changes within Irish monasteries affected the position of abbesses. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the leadership of large churches became more complex. The head of a monastery might be a political ruler rather than a monk. Some leaders controlled lands and revenues, while others supervised religious life. New titles appeared to describe these different roles. Female monasteries were influenced by the same developments. Some abbesses retained control over both spiritual and economic affairs. In other places, a male manager controlled property and finances, while the abbess oversaw the nuns. In such cases, the abbess remained the spiritual heir of the founding saint, but shared authority with male officials. Large monasteries could function almost like small states. Their leaders governed tenants, managed lands, and exercised legal authority. Titles changed over time as these institutions evolved. Female leaders were sometimes described with terms that emphasized authority and lordship, rather than simply religious office. This reflects the growing political importance of certain monasteries. One famous monastery maintained a particularly strong tradition of female leadership. There, the abbess continued to be regarded as the successor of the founding saint, even as male officials appeared alongside her. Bishops and administrators served at the monastery, yet the abbess remained the spiritual heir. Historical records mention many abbesses of this community over several centuries, suggesting that the office retained its prestige. In some places, male leaders eventually replaced female ones. One monastery founded by a holy woman later came under the authority of a male abbot. This did not necessarily mean that women disappeared from the community. A senior nun may still have supervised the nuns, while the abbot controlled property and external relations. Smaller monasteries often remained closer to the older model. Their abbesses supervised daily life, managed resources, and governed tenants. Yet many of these communities eventually came under the influence of larger churches. Religious stories describe nuns placing their monasteries under the authority of famous saints. These traditions probably reflect the growing power of major ecclesiastical centres. Family connections played an important role in monastic leadership. Monasteries often remained under the influence of the families that founded them. Offices passed from one relative to another, sometimes following patterns similar to royal succession. In powerful dynasties, abbesses were chosen from the ruling family, ensuring continued influence over the monastery. In certain cases, the same family controlled several positions at once. Bishops, abbots, and abbesses could all belong to a single ruling house. Through marriage alliances and inheritance, such families strengthened their hold over important religious centres. These arrangements could continue for centuries. The selection of an abbess often followed hereditary patterns. Religious law allowed leadership to remain within the founder's family. Sometimes, successors were chosen before the death of the current abbess in order to prevent disputes. In practice, the choice may have been influenced by powerful relatives as much as by the religious community. Some monasteries clearly preserved leadership within the same lineage for generations. In others, a ruling dynasty gradually replaced the original family. Political power and religious authority were closely connected, and control of a major monastery brought prestige as well as influence. The ceremony by which an abbess entered office was called an ordination. This term emphasized the sacred nature of the position. The ceremony was usually performed by a bishop or another senior church official. In some cases, the head of a nearby monastery presided over the rite, reflecting the dependence of smaller houses on larger ones. In one famous monastery, tradition claimed that the founding abbess had been consecrated with episcopal authority. Later, abbesses were said to inherit some of this dignity. Such claims strengthened the prestige of the office and reinforced the importance of the monastery. Abbesses sometimes appeared at church assemblies. In Ireland, these gatherings included more than bishops alone. Clergy, scholars, and other religious figures might attend. accounts of synods occasionally describe holy women participating in discussions. Their presence shows that prominent abbesses could play a role in wider ecclesiastical affairs. Royal birth often determined which abbesses gained influence beyond their own monasteries. Wealth and family connections mattered as much as religious office. A poor abbess from a minor community had little chance of taking part in major assemblies. The abbess of a powerful monastery, especially one connected to a ruling dynasty, could become an important political and religious figure. In practice, the authority of abbesses varied greatly. Some governed small and isolated communities. Others ruled wealthy monasteries with extensive lands and numerous dependents. Holding the title of abbess did not automatically bring influence. True power depended on resources, family connections, and the prestige of the monastery itself. In the Carolingian lands of continental Europe, the age of living saints had largely passed. Holiness was associated with figures of the distant past, rather than with people still alive. Religious authorities tended to discourage claims of present-day sanctity, and spiritual greatness was usually recognised only after death. Ireland followed a very different path. During the same centuries, both men and women could still be admired as holy individuals within their religious houses and among the local communities that surrounded them. These people were believed to possess a special closeness to God and a power to obtain divine favour through prayer and devotion. Among these figures stands Samthan, one of the most remarkable women of early medieval Ireland. She combined two roles that rarely appear together. She was both a revered holy woman and the abbess of a monastery. Samthan led the community at Clonbrone in the northern Midlands and died in the year 739. Her lifetime coincided with a period when many important legal and religious traditions were being written down, making her a figure who stood at the centre of a formative age. The earliest surviving notice of Samthan is simply the record of her death. Soon afterwards, she appears in several religious texts that preserve memories of her reputation. A later biography survives as well, written generations after her lifetime. Together, these sources show how her memory grew from that of a respected abbess into that of a celebrated saint. Early records emphasize Samthan as a leader rather than as a miracle worker. The pattern of recorded deaths connected with Clonbrone suggests that she raised the status of the monastery to a level it had never before achieved. She was the first abbess of the place whose death was recorded, even though she had not founded the monastery. Later, abbesses were remembered in succession, while none before her were noted. This suggests that the monastery only became prominent during her lifetime. Although no contemporary description survives, later traditions credit Samthan with expanding the monastery physically. New buildings were constructed under her leadership. A wooden chapel was erected and the area of the monastery was enlarged. Additional structures were added to house the growing community. The prominence of construction stories in her biography suggests that these memories preserved real developments. Building on this scale implies increased population and greater resources. The growth of Clonbrone therefore seems closely connected with her leadership. Several explanations are possible for this success. She may have gained the support of a powerful family, perhaps even her own relatives. Genealogies preserved about her suggest connections with important lineages. At the same time, her personal reputation must have played a role. Strong character and visible devotion could attract both followers and benefactors. The belief that she possessed spiritual gifts and miraculous powers may also have drawn attention to the monastery. Most likely, her influence rested on a combination of family connections, leadership ability, and spiritual authority. Another category consisted of women known for performing miracles. Such individuals were regarded as rare and irreplaceable. Because of their importance, they were not to be removed from their home territories even when injured or ill. The community valued their presence too highly to risk losing them. This special treatment applied to male and female holy persons alike. Certain holy women also possessed unusual legal independence. While most women required a male guardian in legal matters, exceptional religious women could sometimes act on their own authority. They might enter agreements, control property, or make decisions without seeking permission. These privileges were probably reserved for women whose reputation for holiness placed them above ordinary social expectations. Holy women could also receive burial honours, normally reserved for important religious figures. Some were buried inside churches or alongside revered saints. Such treatment reflected the belief that spiritual rank transcended ordinary social distinctions. Property rights offer further evidence of their independence. Traditions preserve examples of women receiving land and dedicating it to religious purposes. Other women manage property that they had acquired themselves. These activities show that some religious women exercised real authority over material resources as well as spiritual matters. Pilgrimage formed another path to distinction. Stories from these centuries describe women travelling to distant monasteries or sacred places. Such journeys were treated as natural expressions of devotion and were not generally discouraged. Some women travelled only within Ireland, while others dreamed of journeys beyond the island. Pilgrimage was regarded as a form of spiritual exile undertaken for the sake of God, and those who embraced it were honoured for their sacrifice. As the practice developed, the wandering pilgrim gained high prestige. Leaving one's homeland for religious reasons was seen as a sign of deep commitment. Legal traditions recognise both men and women who lived this way, though little is known about their daily lives. They remain shadowy figures whose importance is visible mainly through the respect accorded to them. Taken together, these traditions reveal a society in which certain women achieved remarkable spiritual authority. During the 7th to 9th centuries, some women were revered to such an extent that they were regarded as saints even while alive. Their influence could shape both religious communities and the surrounding society. Abbesses continued to lead monasteries, and although monastic institutions changed over time, the position remained important and sought after. Some monasteries preserved strong traditions of female leadership for centuries. Beyond the abbesses themselves stood other holy women who commanded respect through devotion, wisdom, and spiritual power. These traditions reveal a culture that held exceptional religious women in high esteem. In some accounts, Ireland itself was said to rest upon two great spiritual pillars, one of them a woman. Stories of figures such as Samthan show that holy women could influence monks, clergy, and lay people alike. For all the political turbulence of the 10th, 11th, and early 12th centuries, everyday female religious life in Ireland seems to have carried on with surprising continuity. The basic structure of women's devotion did not collapse or reinvent itself. The familiar paths remained in place. There were still women who entered as lifelong virgins, and there were still women who came later in life as penitents, often after marriage or widowhood. These two tracks continue to shape how communities understood a nun's identity, responsibilities, and spiritual expectations. Clothing, which mattered deeply in medieval religious culture, also suggests stability. Virgins were still associated with white garments at the moment they were received into the religious life, and this tradition appears to have lasted into the period around 1200. Writers retelling the lives of great saints even felt it important to emphasize that a famous foundress had worn white when she was consecrated, as if to underline an older norm that remained meaningful. Penitent women, on the other hand, appear in later commentary, wearing white with a dark edging, a small but striking detail because Irish sources rarely describe nuns' dress at all. The fact that this description stands out so sharply makes it feel less like a passing fashion and more like a long-standing convention that simply went unmentioned in earlier centuries. The second tier of women's religious life also looks familiar. Holy widows continue to appear in storytelling about saints, and their piety is treated as an established category rather than a novelty. Some narratives still describe women who wanted the harder road of penitence even while young, as if they were drawn towards strict discipline rather than comfort. Stories also keep presenting women who travel as pilgrims, as well as women who live alone as hermits. These figures do not vanish from the imagination. They remain part of the spiritual landscape, moving through it in ways that feel natural, not scandalous. What does not appear in Ireland is a shift in terminology like the one found in England, where a new word emerged, especially holy women, a term that set them above ordinary nuns and mirrored how monks could be ranked above priests. Ireland does not seem to develop that sort of vocabulary split. The Irish material, as a whole, continues to speak as though female religious life is a broad field with recognised grades, not a newly restructured hierarchy with fresh labels. There is, however, one intriguing detail that may hint at a localised change. Some Irish lives of a major saint associated with Glendalough describe black nuns living at the monastery, and the language is so unusual for Ireland that it immediately raises questions. In one telling, women who had been restored to life were brought back and made into black nuns within the saint's church. In another, the same moment is retold in verse, again using the phrase black nuns and describing them as devout and proper. The phrase is striking because Irish custom typically connected white clothing even with penitents. That makes a fully dark habit feel like something imported or newly adopted. One possible explanation is outside influence. The religious world between Ireland and Western Britain was not sealed. People crossed the sea for study, for devotion, and for ecclesiastical business. Ideas travelled with them. A dark-habited group at Glendalough could reflect a British inspiration rather than a direct continental one. Another possibility is more practical and less dramatic. Perhaps the phrase black nun simply meant a penitent grade at a time when dress conventions were shifting from white with a dark border to something darker overall. Yet the women in the story are described as religious travellers, and the older convention of white clothing still echoes elsewhere. That makes a full change to black seem unlikely unless something significant had happened. Adding to the uncertainty, some later retellings do not mention black nuns at all, which leaves open the possibility that both the phrase and the tradition belong to a later century, rather than the early medieval period itself. Whatever the case with that rare term, the intellectual life of nuns during these centuries appears strong. The stories do not only praise brilliant female saints, they also assume that nuns read, taught students, trained learners through the Psalms, and handled books with confidence. Some narratives describe a community of women educating a converted king and a princess, as well as reading among themselves. One tradition claims that a girl travelled from across the sea to study at an Irish women's house, excelled so greatly that she later became an abbess back home, and carried that training into leadership. Another famous centre is portrayed as a place of exceptional learning, famous enough for later writers to describe a magnificent manuscript associated with it, spoken of as a marvel of craft and devotion. There is also direct evidence that women in religious life used written prayers personally and repeatedly. Two devotional texts preserved from the 12th century strongly suggest real reading real memorization, and real use in private prayer. One is voiced as a single woman speaking for herself. She asks for forgiveness, speaks as someone who remembers life in the world and longs to be granted rest among religious widows in the heavenly assembly. The prayer moves through the great Christian story of salvation, then turns inward, pleading for protection from sin and for the strength of virtues that can overcome destructive impulses. Its survival in multiple copies with small differences strongly suggests repeated use. Those changes look like the marks of living devotion rather than the static copying of a library text. The second prayer speaks in a collective voice and fits better with communities of virgins. It presents the religious life as a bond with Christ and asks for the purity needed to keep that bond. It also names the struggle against bodily temptation early on, not as a shameful confession of worldly experience, but as a discipline that belongs to virginity itself. Again, the small variations between copies point toward actual use, possibly communal recitation, rather than a prayer that merely existed on paper. When it comes to legal and ecclesiastical status, the trail becomes thin. Later commentary occasionally hints that women's standing may have improved, suggesting that a woman's moral reputation could strengthen her credibility. Yet the evidence is too brief and too unclear to build firm conclusions. What can be said more confidently is that enclosure does not appear to tighten in any obvious way. Holy women continue to travel freely in the stories, and even less famous nuns seem to move through the world without being portrayed as breaking a rule. The monastery comes across not as a sealed cage, but as a sacred base, a place to do God's work rather than a wall separating women from society. In England, queens became closely involved in monastic reform, shaping institutions and patronage in visible ways. Ireland does not show the same pattern, partly because it did not experience the same type of reform movement, and partly because its political structures were different. Still, there are signs of powerful royal women engaging with religious sites through rebuilding projects, gifts, and burial choices, even if the full scale of their involvement is hard to measure. Abbesses remain visible through death notices, especially at Kildare. And something important changes in what those notices imply. By the 12th century, the office associated with Bridget's succession was no longer consistently held by women who had entered as virgins. Several abbesses are described as dying in penitence, a phrase also used for men and not meant as a stain. It signals that these were people who turned seriously toward religious discipline later in life. Whether such women held the office while still living in the world, as some church managers did, or whether they received the veil before taking authority is hard to pin down. Yet records of violent seizures suggest these were indeed consecrated women. In more than one political takeover, the abbess is physically seized, dragged away, and abused. In one account, she is explicitly called a nun. That detail matters. It makes it difficult to imagine the office as merely administrative or symbolic. It points instead to an abbess who was publicly recognised as a religious woman and whose body, tragically, could be targeted as part of a power struggle. Women also appear as managers of church property in this period, showing that leadership roles were not limited to male officials. A female church manager is recorded at one major church, and the term used for such a figure could also be applied to an abbess, which suggests that titles were flexible and sometimes overlapped. In saintly narratives from these later centuries, abbesses continue to act as decisive figures, not as passive heads under male control. They supervise, vouch for, and discipline their communities. They are shown as the head of nuns, a concept that echoes older Irish ideas of guardianship and authority. These stories even present abbesses acting in ways that resemble the powers of a household guardian. In some narratives, an abbess arranges a marriage, not only guiding a woman's spiritual life, but also negotiating social alliances. One story describes a skilled craftsman seeking both land and a wife, and the abbess grants him both as part of an agreement connected with building work for the monastery. In another, an abbess is approached by a warrior relative who asks for a bride from among her girls in exchange for doing what she requests. The abbess then confronts a fosterling with a stark choice between God and the man, and the girl chooses the religious life so completely that she dies on the spot. The story is extreme and clearly crafted for moral force, but it still reveals how later writers imagined an abbess's power. She decides, she negotiates, she directs lives, and she challenges men to abandon violence and desire. In more ordinary matters, the later narratives look like the earlier ones. Abbesses secure food and drink in times of shortage, seek supplies from other houses, oversee building projects, and deal with craftsmen. They also obtain books and scribes, ordering the copying of sacred texts. For their nuns, they lend books, send nuns with manuscripts to other communities, accept fosterlings, take in abandoned children, and manage the presence of families visiting those children. Whatever changes were happening in the wider church, these stories preserve an older world in which female sanctity and female leadership could still carry weight. Monastic politics in these centuries is easier to trace because the record of conflict is fuller. Yet the survival of a community cannot be judged only by whether abbess deaths were recorded. Sometimes silence is just the habit of scribes. Physical remains, rebuilding, and the presence of relic traditions can speak just as loudly. Relics become especially central. They are not merely devotional objects, they are instruments used in public life. Oaths are sworn on them. They are carried on circuits to gather revenue. They are brought to assemblies and into battle. They are used for blessing and for cursing by ritual movement around people or places. One direction to protect, another to condemn. The relics most frequently honoured are bells and croziers, and these are not uniquely male possessions. Traditions insist that female saints left behind bells and staffs of authority, and that these objects were treated as powerful by men and women alike. A holy woman's relic could be carried with the same confidence as a man's, and its force was imagined as equally effective. Some writers even boast about large reliquary collections that mix remains linked to male saints and female saints together, presenting them as a single treasury of holiness. The language used in such claims does not suggest that women's relics were lesser. Instead, it treats them as fully part of the same sacred economy, equally worthy of veneration, equally capable of healing, and equally feared in conflict. Unlike England, where some large women's houses appear to have suffered disruption under new reforms, Ireland shows continuity. The greatest threat came not from reorganising church authorities, but from raids and warfare. Yet devotion to female saints does not seem to fade. Their cults remain strong, and their sites continue to attract attention. Some places remain difficult to trace. A women's house close to major centres is absent from the annals, and it may have dissolved as a religious community. Yet the name survives in later military context, hinting that the site still mattered as a place, even if its original function had changed. Other houses stand out clearly. Kildare, associated with the Saint Monena, remains important for centuries and survives deep into the later medieval period. It suffers attack, becomes a stage for violent encounters, and yet endures. Its buildings evolve, with older and newer churches standing side by side. Stories about Monena spread far beyond Ireland, and her reputation grows across the Irish Sea. Traditions preserve her tools and garments as tangible objects linked to her life, while also claiming that her body and staff went elsewhere, as if to extend her influence into another region through relic movement. In the south, another female saint's site continues as a place of pilgrimage with visible remains and popular devotion. A small early structure survives, alongside later church buildings and sacred stones, and a holy well remains part of the living landscape. These sites suggest long continuity of worship, even where written lives are missing. Kildare, linked with Ita, is quieter in the annals, but loud in storytelling. The sheer number of narratives that bring Ita into the lives of male saints implies that her monastery remained important and well connected. Writers repeatedly claim that their saint had known her, learned from her, or received her hospitality. Kildare becomes famous for fostering children, boys and girls, and for shaping future leaders. Later, retellings emphasize its network of relationships, with other major houses presenting it almost like a crossroads of sanctity and training. The cult of Lasser is more complicated. Several churches carry her name in later sources, and different locations claim her patronage. Some earlier references vanish while new sites rise into prominence. One church becomes the centre of her story, and the narrative seems shaped by local interests, including the right to collect dues from surrounding lands. Later, records still remember a successor described as her heir, which suggests that the community's identity was durable, even as details shifted. Yet the uneven evidence also raises the possibility that more than one saintly figure became blended under the same name across time. Clonbrone, made famous earlier by Samthan, clearly continues as a major female house. Abbesses are recorded as dying there, and some are explicitly named as heirs of Samthan. Later traditions preserve stories of Samthan's involvement in regional conflict and celebrate her with poems and genealogies, signals that the house still had political and social relevance. Other saintly lives also claim ties with her, as if connection to Samthan added prestige. Kildare is the most vivid of all in this period, both as a physical place and as a political prize. Later sources describe multiple churches and special structures within the precinct, suggesting a complex and busy, sacred landscape. A round tower is reported, and the main church eventually shifts from wood to stone. Later, rebuilding efforts by new rulers produce a huge cathedral, reflecting the continuing prestige of the site even after earlier disruptions. Relics at Kildare follow a dramatic path. In earlier centuries, the bodies of the founding figures were placed in honour within the church. Later, they were enshrined, then lost in the chaos of raids. One set disappears permanently. The other is later claimed to have been found again far away, in a story shaped by politics, conquest, and the desire to control sacred prestige. The narrative of rediscovery becomes part of a wider reshaping of the past, showing how relics could be used to rewrite legitimacy. One building at Kildare becomes especially famous. A stone structure associated with a perpetual fire. Pilgrims in later centuries treat it as the centre of a surviving pre-Christian cult, imagining it as a temple from a distant pagan age. Yet the evidence supports a different reading. The fire and its house appear late in written records, and other monasteries had similar structures and hearths without being framed as pagan survivals. The style of the building fits early Christian monastic architecture, rather than the pre-Christian period. Without excavation proving older layers beneath it, the simplest explanation is that it belonged to monastic life and practical need, not an ancient temple preserved intact through centuries. Politically, Kildare remains central and dangerous. Control of the community is fought over by dynasties, and the site is treated as both sacred ground and strategic territory. Viking forces ravage it in the wider struggle for dominance. Local rulers also use it as a stage for internal conflict. And the office of the abbess remains so symbolically powerful that it becomes a target in the most brutal way. One seizure is remembered with particular horror. In a struggle for power, an abbess is attacked and sexually assaulted. Not as a private crime, but as a political act intended to disqualify and humiliate, to mark control over the institution itself. A rival then drags the attacker out and kills him where the outrage occurred. The logic is chilling, but it reveals how deeply the abbess's position mattered. Even when men sought control of the site, the female head remained a living emblem of legitimacy. A later seizure is recorded in equally stark terms. Kildare is stormed and burned. Many are killed. The abbess is captured and forced into sexual violation as part of the takeover. The record does not treat this as rumour or metaphor. It presents it as a deliberate instrument of conquest, aimed at breaking the sanctity and authority that the abbess embodied. From an ecclesiastical point of view, the internal organisation of Kildare during the 10th, 11th and 12th centuries remains partly hidden. One unusual feature stands out, however. The community followed what later tradition called the Placentine rule. The origin of this rule was explained through a strange and memorable story. According to the tradition, the rule came from a church said to lie beneath a distant sea. A young boy from Kildare, travelling on a ship bound for Rome, supposedly fell into the water and discovered the sacred text below the waves. He returned with it, and from that moment the community adopted the rule. Behind this tale lay a practical problem. Kildare had to explain why its customs differed from the standard Roman practices that were becoming increasingly influential. The name of the rule pointed toward the northern Italian city of Piacenza, a region associated with strong monastic traditions and independent ecclesiastical customs. It is possible that Kildare once maintained contact with religious communities connected to that region. Beyond that possibility, the story remains uncertain, and surviving sources provide no clear explanation. Kildare's institutional standing changed dramatically in the middle of the 12th century. A major church assembly reorganised the Irish Church and gave formal structure to its hierarchy. Authority became concentrated in new metropolitan centres, and Kildare lost the position it had once enjoyed. Yet even as the institution declined in rank, the figure of Bridget remained powerful. Her relics continued to circulate, and stories about her influence continued to grow. Later, traditions even claimed that she had sponsored the baptism of other saints and helped raise them to high positions in the church. Her reputation endured not only in Ireland, but also across Europe, where churches continued to honour her name. In this sense, Bridget's spiritual authority survived long after the political importance of Kildare had faded. There are strong hints that the abbess of Kildare once exercised an authority greater than that of other abbesses in Ireland. Earlier religious poetry already described Bridget as the spiritual leader of Ireland's nuns, a title that later writers took quite literally. Some traditions claimed that Bridget and Patrick divided responsibility for Ireland between them, with Bridget guiding the women and Patrick guiding the men. In these accounts, Bridget appears not simply as the founder of one monastery, but as the symbolic head of female religious life across the island. Later, religious songs repeated the same idea. They praised Patrick as patron of Ireland's saints, while celebrating Bridget as the protector of its virgins. Together, they were presented as complementary figures whose authority embraced the entire Christian community. A remarkable tradition developed around Bridget's consecration. According to later stories, a bishop accidentally granted her episcopal status when she first entered religious life. The ceremony was said to have gone beyond what was intended, giving her the rank of a bishop rather than the simpler religious grade she had originally sought. In some versions, the bishop realised what had happened only afterward and declared that Bridget alone would hold such an honour. Over time, the story evolved. Later, writers claimed that the abbesses who followed Bridget inherited this distinction. According to these traditions, each successor of Bridget possessed the dignity and status associated with a bishop. Some texts even stated that the abbess was entitled to receive episcopal honours and to be treated with the same respect as a bishop. These claims appear only in later sources and are absent from the earliest accounts of Bridget's life. Their appearance reflects the growing political and ecclesiastical ambitions of Kildare in the centuries before the church reforms. The idea that the abbess possessed episcopal authority had practical implications. In the medieval church, bishops possessed the power to consecrate abbesses and oversee monastic communities. If the abbess of Kildare held such rank, she may have exercised influence over other women's monasteries throughout Ireland. This would have placed Kildare at the centre of a network of female religious communities. Although surviving records do not describe such authority in detail, scattered references suggest that the abbess held an unusually elevated position. Legal traditions also hint at this special status. In one interpretation of early Irish law, the honour price owed for crimes committed against a nun was partly payable to the successor of Bridget. This detail suggests that Kildare was seen as having a protective role over nuns beyond its own walls. If this interpretation is correct, the abbess of Kildare held a position unmatched by any other woman in Ireland. The strength of Bridget's cult is reflected in the large number of relics associated with her during this period. One tradition described a veil placed upon her head during her consecration, preserved as a sacred object and honoured by later generations. Another relic was a wooden beam that had supported the altar during the ceremony. According to tradition, Bridget had touched the beam, and afterward it became immune to decay. Even when the church burned, the beam was said to have survived unharmed. At some point, the wood was believed to have taken on the character of the sacred timber associated with the Ark of the Covenant, linking the relic symbolically with biblical history. Another object connected with Bridget was a great oak tree at Kildare. Later, accounts described the tree as blessed by the saint and credited with miraculous powers. Pilgrims valued even the smallest fragments of its wood, believing that pieces broken off by hand carried divine protection. The tree itself probably gained its reputation only in later centuries. Earlier accounts of Bridget do not mention it. The story likely arose from attempts to explain the meaning of Kildare's name, which referred simply to an oak-built church rather than to a sacred tree. Similar traditions of miraculous trees appeared at other monasteries during the same period, suggesting a broader fashion for such stories. Bridget's relics remained objects of intense devotion. Toward the end of the 12th century, a dramatic announcement claimed that the bodies of Patrick, Bridget, and Columba had been discovered together in a northern church. The ceremony marking their reburial was carried out with great splendour under the supervision of church authorities. Yet, contemporary Irish records barely acknowledge the event, suggesting that not everyone accepted the claim. Whatever the truth of the discovery, the story reinforced the idea of the three saints as the spiritual protectors of Ireland. Some modern interpretations have argued that female saints were associated mainly with small domestic miracles and humble activities. The surviving traditions tell a different story. Female saints were believed to influence political events, protect warriors, and guide entire communities. Their authority was not limited to women. Kings and warriors sought their help just as eagerly as monks and laypeople. Monena provides one striking example. Her reputation extended far beyond her own monastery. Stories described her authority reaching across entire regions where rulers acknowledged her influence and confirmed her rights to land. She was said to have settled disputes with kings and guided their families into religious life. In some traditions, she travelled across the sea, founding churches in distant lands and establishing communities wherever she went. At the end of her life, leaders and nobles gathered around her, pleading that she remain alive for their sake. They believed that whatever she asked of God would be granted. Although she refused their request, she gave them personal possessions to carry into battle, promising that these objects would bring victory if used in defense of their homeland. Such stories portray her not as a minor spiritual figure, but as a leader whose influence extended into warfare and politics. Other saints appear in similar roles. Eta was remembered as the spiritual mother of an entire people. Rulers came to her to grant land and seek blessings. She intervened to save prisoners from execution and guided warriors toward repentance. When her people went to war, she prayed for their success and was credited with their victories. At her death, crowds gathered to honour the woman they had accepted as their protector and mother. Samthan also appears as a commanding figure who confronted rulers and defended her monastery's rights. Lasser was remembered as imposing tribute across a wide territory and pronouncing blessings on those who obeyed and curses on those who refused. The language attributed to her is strikingly forceful, promising prosperity or destruction according to the people's loyalty. Even if such declarations reflect later claims rather than historical events, they show how strongly people believed in the authority of female saints. The power attributed to these saints was not merely symbolic. People believed that their intervention could determine real events. When a foreign warlord died after attacking monasteries, tradition claimed that he saw himself struck down by the saints whose houses he had plundered. In these stories, female saints stand alongside male saints as defenders of the land. Holy men themselves sometimes turned to female saints for guidance. One story describes a monk who invoked Bridget's name to escape a sea monster and later sought her out to understand why the creature had honoured her above other saints. Another tells of monks visiting her for spiritual instruction, recognising her as a powerful intercessor. In such accounts, female authority is taken for granted rather than questioned. Women also participated in church affairs alongside men. Disputes between religious figures could be judged by assemblies that included both male clerics and holy women. Their presence in such gatherings reflects a world in which spiritual authority was not limited by gender. Female saints became widely celebrated, and many monasteries claimed connections with them. Writers often tried to link their own patron saints with famous holy women in order to share in their prestige. The influence of these saints spread far beyond their original communities, and their cults remained active for centuries. At the same time, attitudes toward women began to change gradually. Later, writers show greater concern with the differences between men and women in religious life. Some stories include skeptical voices questioning why respected monks should visit a female saint. Yet these doubts usually end with the saint's authority being reaffirmed. The challenge becomes a way to demonstrate her power rather than diminish it. Alongside the famous saints stood a much larger number of lesser-known holy women. Their names appear in genealogies, lists, and calendars of feast days. Many are remembered as relatives of well-known male saints. These connections were not accidental. Genealogists used female kinship to link saints with powerful families and important monasteries, creating networks of prestige and influence. Some lists record women simply by name and by the church associated with them. These brief notices could later be used to support claims of kinship or authority. Through such records, monasteries could extend their influence by asserting connections with other sacred sites. One surviving list of a famous saint's family illustrates this process in detail. It names his mother, sisters, and other female relatives, along with the churches and burial places connected with them. Such information allowed later writers to establish relationships between different communities and to support claims of shared heritage. Traditions also placed women within the households of great saints. Some were remembered as dressmakers, attendants, or students who lived within monastic families. Others were said to have travelled with missionaries or studied in monastic schools. These stories reveal how religious communities imagined their own past, blending history with devotion. Many accounts describe holy women living quietly at small churches and being buried there. Pilgrims visited their graves and believed in their power to intercede before God. Some sites became centres of local devotion that survived for generations. Although political motives influenced the preservation of these traditions, the women themselves were not merely names in genealogies. Their feast days were celebrated, and prayers invoked their protection against danger and illness. Devotional texts call upon dozens of female saints to guard believers from enemies, sickness, and misfortune. For those who recited these prayers, the saints were living powers whose protection extended into every aspect of life.